Let's take this to the animal world and talk about foods there that people consider healthy, but we need to maybe take a closer look.
Some people have sensitivities to eggs. And recently, something came out about eggs. Vital Farms got called out for feeding their chickens marigold flowers to make the eggs more orange. It is true that if you have a chicken that is grazing, rooting and pecking in the wild, quote unquote, and they're getting bugs and worms and maybe sometimes they'll eat little mice or voles, that egg is going to be very orange because they're eating what they're supposed to eat. But you can circumvent the process. You can shortcut it by feeding them marigold flowers, and it makes it look really orange, but it's not really a reflection of a much higher nutrition content in that egg yolk. Most of us can understand that if you're eating chickens raised by a chicken mega farm and they're just eating grains and they're in cages all day, that's probably not super healthy. And there have also been some studies looking at chicken feed. And we know that what a chicken eats determines the amount of linoleic acid in the egg yolk. Historically, chickens didn't eat a lot of grains, and they had much lower levels of linoleic acid in the egg yolk. Now, for people that aren't familiar, linoleic acid is an 18-carbon omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid. It occurs naturally in our foods, but I think that evolutionarily inappropriate consumption of high amounts of that are a driver of issues for humans. That's sort of foreshadowing a conversation about seed oils, which are simply the biggest source of linoleic acid that we get in our diets, and linoleic acid that's also been through some pretty heavy refining. Eggs contain linoleic acid. It's not toxic, but I think that for a lot of us, we're getting too much of it because we might be eating eggs that are fed grains, which increases the amount of linoleic acid. If you're eating bacon, those pigs are also fed grains. Now, pigs aren't supposed to eat grains. They're not supposed to eat corn and soy, and that sort of artificially elevates the amount of linoleic acid in pig fat. So if you have bacon and eggs for breakfast, you could be getting a lot of linoleic acid in your diet. And again, this isn't refined, bleached, and deodorized seed oils, which I think are much worse. And in general, I think animal foods are very healthy for humans, but quality matters. And so if we're really being honest, we have to think about what we are eating eats. And if a chicken is eating grains and if a pig is eating grains, the fact of the matter is that the fat in those animals, whether it's chicken meat or eggs or pork fat, is enriched with linoleic acid at a level that you wouldn't find in a wild variant of those things. Now, why is this a problem? I think that excess linoleic acid in the human diet leads to excess linoleic acid in human cell membranes. And that creates an oxidative liability for us. It puts extra stress on the body. It's sort of like having extra dry wood around your cabin in the mountains and always running your wood-burning stove. And is a spark going to fly out and cause a fire? Yeah, it's just a problem for us in our membranes. And there's some interesting studies that have been done about membrane sort of turnover and the idea that when we have less polyunsaturated fats in our membranes, we tend to do better. So that's a whole rabbit hole we could go down. But this polyunsaturated ratio to saturated fat ratio in cell membranes is highly influenced by the amount of polyunsaturated fats we eat. Humans have interesting biochemistry. We can make saturated fats and interconvert them with monounsaturated fats, but we can't interconvert polyunsaturated fats with mono or anything else. We can't saturate fats in the same way that we can between a mono and a saturated fat. So a monounsaturated fat has one double bond, but a polyunsaturated fat has multiple double bonds, and we can't turn a polyunsaturated fat into a monounsaturated fat. And that's a problem. Ruminants can do that. So cows, interestingly, a cow doesn't have the same change in their fatty acid composition when they're fed grains. This isn't an argument to eat grain-fed cattle. I'm much more a fan of grass-fed cattle for a variety of reasons, but ruminants don't do that. But any monogastric animal, be it humans, be it chickens, be it pigs, those are the main, chickens and pigs are the main things we eat that are monogastric. We accumulate polyunsaturated fats. So that's something to think about. The quality of your eggs matters. And unfortunately, today, I don't want this to sound impossible for people listening to the podcast. It's very difficult to find good eggs unless you make your own, because the majority of eggs, even if they are pasture raised and organic, are fed corn and soy. This came out with Vital Farms, right? So we have evolutionarily inappropriate amounts of linoleic acid in the diets of pigs and chickens, creating chicken fat, eggs, and pork, which might not be as good for us or what our bodies are expecting based on what we've experienced evolutionarily. The other thing I'll say about eggs is for some people, the albumin in egg yolks can cause autoimmune reactions. It's just an immune thing that happens. And so if you have autoimmune conditions, maybe cutting eggs for a short amount of time is a good idea. The other thing we could think about is pasteurized milk. And I will draw a clear distinction between pasteurized milk and raw milk. Raw milk has not been heated. And there's been a lot of talk about raw milk recently with the whole bird flu thing. And we can get into that if you want. But if you look at the research, raw milk clearly affects the immune system, I would say, in a positive way. And pasteurized milk is either net zero or negative. And I think a lot of people listening to this podcast have had negative experiences with, quote, milk that they drank growing up. I did, other people I know. And so I think that the evidence points to the notion that when you pasteurize milk, when you heat milk, there's a conformational change in the whey protein, and that can maybe be immunogenic for some people, cause issues with the immune system. So I'm not a huge fan of pasteurized milk. The other thing we have to talk about now is Bovaer. Have you heard of this?
No, actually, I haven't.
It's Bovaer. And Bovaer is an additive. You can fact check me on this. It may be connected with Bill Gates. So fact check that, please. But that's at least what's come up in some, colloquial conversations I've had with friends recently. It's an additive given to cows, mostly dairy cows. A lot of them are in Australia, but they're in other places in the world too, that's decreasing methane emissions. And we don't really know what this additive is going to do to humans. It's not really safe and it hasn't fully been tested. So now you have to think more about your dairy and potentially meat from a cow that's fed Bovaer, Bovaer. And I think the whole thing is a little bit ludicrous because it's based on the premise that methane from cows is a significant contributor to any sort of climate on this earth that we live. And I think that's crazy and unsubstantiated. If we believe that carbon dioxide is a major driver of climate change, which people debate heavily on both sides. But if we accept that, we know that methane in the atmosphere does become carbon dioxide eventually. Cows do produce methane, but so do humans when we fart or burp. And that methane that animals produce is part of a carbon cycle. And it's a very, very small contribution to overall methane or carbon dioxide equivalents in our atmosphere relative to energy production, your cross-country plane flight, driving a car, using your home. I mean, these are massive. I'm talking, if you look at the United States based on EPA data, agriculture in animals, I believe, is around 2.6% of total CO2 equivalents. 2.6% animal agriculture. Plant agriculture is 2.6 or 2.7. So just the amount of carbon dioxide equivalents produced by eating plants because of the use of tilling and all of the machines on the farm that produce exhaust and the use of trucks to move the plants across the country produces the same amount of carbon dioxide equivalents as animal foods. But no one is calling for a kale hiatus, right? No one's calling for major tariffs on kale because of the huge amount of carbon dioxide impact related to kale. It's clearly, I would say, politically motivated here, or driven by companies looking to make profit on ultra-processed plant foods or ultra-processed animal foods. But ultra-processed food in general is much more profitable than unprocessed food. And then if you break down the 2.6% of animal agriculture, only about 1.8% of that is cattle. So we're looking at a 1.8%. And if you look at the relative contributions of energy, electricity generation, transportation, those are in the 25 to 30% margin. So we have more than 10x in other sectors of our sort of overall economy. And no one is really focusing on that, right? We're just being told, look at the cows. And now we're feeding cows a chemical that we don't fully understand the long-term health effects in humans to ostensibly decrease methane emissions, which are part of a carbon cycle and have always been there and are probably not a significant contributor to any sort of climate change in the first place. It's ludicrous. So that's my overall take on animal foods in terms of possible issues.
Okay, let's stick on this cow piece and this chemical, because this is new to me. Is this something that will be found in conventional beef and organic and grass-fed, grass-finished? Or just conventional?
Only conventional. They can't feed it to a cow that's organic. And my sense is it's mostly dairy cows. So it's going to end up in pasteurized milk. It's going to end up in butter. But I do think it's actually being fed to some cows that will be used for meat. But it can't be an organic meat. And it can't be in something that's called grass-fed, grass-finished, I don't think. Although we'd have to look at the regulations and it's probably country by country. So it gets back to sort of know your farm, know the quality of what you're eating.
All right. While we're talking about new chemicals and cows, in preparing for this interview, I heard you talk about this new thing that they're giving to cows where they can eat less calories and put on body fat. So another way where humans are going in, interjecting, and creating this frankenfood.
Not a new thing, unfortunately. It's been around for, I would say, decades. It's well known in mainstream ranching circles. And I've talked to Dave Asprey and I talked to Dale Brisby about this. One of the compounds they can give to cows is called zearalenone or zearalenone. It's a mold toxin, and they put this little pellet in the cow's ear, and it basically causes metabolic dysfunction. And so you feed the cow less and they get fatter in some sort of sinister mirroring of what's happening to humans. If it's interesting that there are compounds in our environments, this compound directly given to cattle, that can break our metabolism. So you can eat an equivalent amount of calories and gain more weight, right? That's a really interesting paradigm. That's a really interesting model system to look at what's happening to humans. Humans aren't being fed this chemical that we know of. Maybe parts of it are getting into our food supply, or potentially it's contaminating meat when they give the cows this chemical in their ear and it goes in their whole body, or dairy. But yeah, I mean, the savings are pretty massive for these farmers and these ranchers. They can give, I mean, I was talking to Dale Brisby, who's a rancher and has done this. And he said, I mean, it's like a 20 to 30% reduction in feed cost for these farmers, which is incredible when you're thinking about the slim profit margin of a rancher. I mean, there aren't many cattle ranchers who drive Lamborghinis. I don't think I know any. Like, this isn't a lucrative business. This is a hard business done to create, I would say, some of the most nutrient-dense food for humans. It's not always done in the best way, unfortunately, but this is an interesting thing that you can give a cow a metabolic toxin and feed them 20% less food, and they gain the same amount of weight. That's crazy. And that's probably exactly what's happening to humans. Again, maybe not the same chemical, but I think there are many of these metabolic toxins in our environment that are making it harder for us to lose weight and making the calorie idea kind of go out the window. Because if not all calories are created equally, and the hypothesis that arises from this becomes, wait, if I eat 200 calories of Doritos, am I going to store more of that as fat than 200 calories of steak? And I would say there's a real possibility you are. So if you are struggling with weight loss, the quality of your food is just as important, if not more important, than the number of calories you eat.
So to me, there's two different layers to this last point we brought up, where they're feeding this chemical to cows. Actually, not feeding them. You mentioned it goes in the ear.
I think it goes in the ear, yeah, a lot of times. Or they inject it or something, yeah.
So we have to look at, does that make it, you mentioned this quickly, into the meat, and then we consume it, and then does that break our metabolism? And then number two, even if it doesn't, we're still having chemical changes, I'm sure, in that meat that we're consuming. And how is that interacting with our biology? Because we're tempering with the meat before it's, butchered and then consumed.
We don't fully know, right? It's never really been studied. The FDA, the USDA turns a blind eye here and doesn't really call for the appropriate amount of studies to be done. So it's an economics thing in terms of ranching, because it's hard to convince people to pay more for their meat. I think that we don't always understand what goes into making a steak, and that's a tricky thing. Yeah, I mean, it's creating a metabolically unwell cow. So even if only trace amounts of that chemical are found in the meat, are there other problems with the meat because of the metabolic dysfunction that this chemical is causing?
Exactly. So are we assuming that cows that are organic or grass-fed, grass-finished, again, won't have this latter issue?
They should not. They should not.
And this is why this part of the conversation is just as important as the plants that we were beating up early on, because even in the meat realm, you can think you're doing great for your health and you're eating healthy, but there is so much nuance even to this health food.
We are literally being bombarded with toxins, and that sounds like hyperbole, but I don't believe it is. They're everywhere now. It's crazy in our food supply, in plant foods and in animal foods, like we talked about, in dairy, in meat, in leaves, it's all over the place. And then it's also in our living environments too. So in our clothes, it's difficult. And again, I don't mean this to be a message of despondency for anyone listening. I think it's a message of education and a message of know better, do better. If you understand, you can navigate the environment. We simply have come to a place in 2024 where our world has gotten quite complicated. And I know that more and more people are suffering. I mean, obesity rates are rising, infertility rates are rising. It's all going in the wrong direction. And many, many people are suffering with chronic health illnesses, everything from autoimmune conditions, thyroid conditions, skin issues, depression, anxiety. I mentioned infertility, low libido. We're a very, very sick culture. And I think based on my experience in Western medicine, being a doctor, Western medicine doesn't have answers to this. And Western medicine isn't really asking the right questions. And so we're left to our own devices as consumers to educate ourselves. And it's not, the response should not be, I hope the response for people is not, oh my God, this is impossible, but let me learn as much as I can and go step by step and do what I can today and do a little more tomorrow and eventually get to the place where my life is significantly healthier weeks to months later. And you have to know about these inputs to make those intentional decisions.
I want to come back to the part of the conversation where you talked about different animals and linoleic acid. This is really important, and this is a part of the conversation that's really pertinent to me because it's part of where I'm at right now on my health journey, where up until this point, I've looked for the organic label, grass-fed, grass-finished. But when it comes to chicken, you're adding this whole other layer in pork where it's not good enough to go to Costco now and get organic chicken, buy organic pork at Whole Foods, organic bacon. These animals, being monogastric, need to have the right foods to have the right fat composition for our bodies. And the other detail there that you added, which is great, is the fact that for people who are, say, on a budget or don't have access, it's different with cows due to their digestion. So you can get away with, not that we're recommending it, but you can get away with less quality and more conventional beef, and the quality of that end product will be better than if we're talking about chickens and pork. So the part I want to dive a bit deeper into is linoleic acid. You brought that up in relation to that. Do we know percentages of what linoleic acid would be in chicken and fish? Sorry, not fish. We're going to get to fish. Chicken and pork when fed their correct diet versus grains.
Yeah, we do. So historically, if you look at traditionally raised pigs, wild pigs, chickens, things like this, 3 to 4%, maybe 4.5% of the fat is linoleic acid. And then you look at a conventionally raised hog, pig, chicken, you get 20+%. So 4 to 5x. So it's pretty significant. And the same thing has happened to humans, which is interesting, Jesse. So you look at the composition of human fat in the last 70 years, and it's gone up significantly. So our fat has also become more full of linoleic acid. And there's a great study by Stephen Guyonnet that looks at that specifically. Like we are becoming more full of polyunsaturated fats in our fat when we do fat biopsies. And animals are also becoming more full of polyunsaturated fats, specifically this 18 carbon omega-6 linoleic acid. And this isn't to say that people should never eat bacon, never eat eggs, or never eat chicken, just that it worries me when red meat specifically is vilified. And people are discouraged from eating red meat, whether it's because of a climate impact, which we briefly touched upon how misleading that might be. I don't really think that the climate impact from any sort of meat is any like legitimate argument to not eat it. People are also dissuaded from eating red meat because of health impacts, which I would argue are completely fabricated. Red meat is one of the healthiest foods for humans. Even if it's grain-fed, it's still healthy for humans and full of so many nutrients. And yet we're being told not to eat red meat. And what are our other options? And we've talked about chicken and pork a little bit, and we can talk about the fish. I would argue that red meat, whether it's beef or lamb or elk, or what do people eat? Bison. These are some of the healthiest foods on the planet, full stop. And to shun those in favor of a grain-fed pork, grain-fed chicken, or farm-raised fish, even a lot of wild fish is heavily contaminated today. I think that's a wrong move. I think that's the bad move. And yeah, I think that we should not fear red meat, and I think we should eat more of it, not less of it.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch a full episode. I'll see you over there.
Excess linoleic acid in the human diet leads to excess linoleic acid in human cell membranes. And that creates an oxidative liability for us. It puts extra stress on the body. It's sort of like having extra dry wood around your cabin in the mountains and always running your wood burning stove. And